Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Have you ever stood in a room filled with warm smiles, clinking glasses, and the smell of roasted beef tenderloin, only to feel like a ghost passing through it all, unnoticed, unmentioned, unseen? That's where I was, just 3 hours before the folder changed everything. My father's retirement party was held at the country club he adored, a place where he'd spent more time than he ever did helping me with algebra or asking how my divorce went. Everything had been planned down to the napkin colors, navy and cream, his alma mater's colors, as my brother proudly explained to a round table of uncles who all laughed like they understood what that meant. I stood near the fireplace, wine glass in hand, my heels biting into the plush carpet, listening to the fourth speech in a row that somehow managed to cover my father's life journey without so much as a mention of me. His military years? Covered. His 3 decades as regional manager at a manufacturing firm no one outside the Midwest cares about? Front and center. His loving wife, my stepmother, with her bulletproof curls and never-aging jawline, got thanked first. Then came Daniel, my younger brother, the rock, the pride, the next generation. Daniel, who once failed out of community college, now glorified for taking over the family's future, whatever that meant. I looked around as the crowd nodded along with every cliché my dad's best friend tossed into the mic. He raised 2 incredible kids. My brows lifted. 2? Incredible? I looked to my left and right, wondering if there was a third sibling I didn't know about, because if I counted as one of the 2, I'd surely have earned at least a footnote. But no. Nothing. That sort of erasure doesn't slap you all at once. It creeps. You tell yourself you're being sensitive. You haven't visited in a while. Maybe they're just nervous with the speeches. Maybe the slideshow will have something. But then the video starts, a montage of childhood photos and home videos with soft acoustic guitar, and what plays is a one-man tribute to Daniel. Baby Daniel in the bathtub. Daniel at Disney. Daniel's high school prom. Dad helping him into a tuxedo. I kept waiting for one snapshot, one frame, one frozen second that acknowledged I existed in this family beyond obligatory holiday texts. Nothing came. I stood still, blinking slowly while others clapped. My cousin Beth turned and smiled at me like we were sharing a moment, but I wasn't smiling back. She turned away fast. No one asked if I was okay. And to be fair, I looked okay. I always do. I've learned that looking okay is the only defense when no one cares enough to ask what's underneath. The thing is, I came back for this. I drove 7 hours. I booked a hotel, not wanting to stay in the house I once called mine. I even bought a dress for this damn night. It wasn't cheap, either silky black, with a neckline just daring enough to whisper, "She's doing fine." And I am doing fine. In fact, I'm doing more than fine. I own my own design studio. I have clients on 3 coasts. I donate to causes my father's friends make jokes about on Facebook. But none of that matters here. Here, I'm just the older daughter who left. There was a moment, just after the main course, when the cake was being rolled out and the playlist shifted to James Taylor, when my father passed by me on his way to the bar. I stepped aside, not expecting much. He paused, smiled, patted my arm like I was a neighbor's niece, and said, "I'm glad you could make it, sweetheart." Just like that. No apology for the silence, no comment about the speeches, no acknowledgement of my 20 years of independence, no "I missed you." Just a generic pat and a Hallmark card smile. You know what's wild? I still helped clean up. When most of the guests had filtered out and the servers began clearing half-drunk wine glasses and crumpled napkins, I grabbed a trash bag and went table to table. My stepmother smiled vaguely in my direction, and Daniel, drunk now and laughing with some old college buddy, gave me a thumbs up like I was the intern at a summer camp. I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, but because silence is sharper when used correctly. Silence cuts cleaner than confrontation. It makes people lean in too late. As I bent to pick up a plate someone left under their chair, I saw a photo on the floor. It had slipped from someone's purse or pocket. It was of my dad and Daniel fishing. I knew the day. It was the one weekend I was grounded for sneaking out, so they went without me. I remember crying when they left, watching from my bedroom window as the truck rolled away. In that moment, holding the photo, I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad. I felt surgical. Like something inside had finally clicked into place. It's funny how revenge doesn't feel like a fire. It feels like clarity. It feels like, for the first time, you're the one holding the scalpel and everyone else is asleep on the table. I finished helping, wiped my hands, smiled politely, and walked upstairs, just once, to his office. I knew exactly where to put it. I didn't linger. I didn't snoop. I just opened the drawer, slid the folder in, closed it softly, and walked out. No label. No signature. Just weight. Truth has its own weight, you know. You can feel it, even if you don't know what's inside. By the time I reached the parking lot, the moon was out. I remember thinking it looked full, even though I knew it wasn't. Funny how things look whole when you're finally done pretending. And that's how I left it. Until the call. But we'll get to that. There's a peculiar kind of pain that doesn't scream or even sting, it settles, like silt in the bottom of a river, dense and quiet and nearly invisible, until someone stirs the water and everything you thought had been buried rises to the surface, clouding everything. That was the feeling I carried with me the morning after the party, while the image of that smiling room, so loud with laughter, so thick with warmth, kept playing in my head like a bad sitcom rerun. Only this time I saw it for what it was. Not a celebration of a man's career or his family's love for him, but a staged tribute to a narrative that never included me in the first place. Even as a kid, I always knew that I wasn't the favorite, not in the dramatic, soap opera way where the unloved child is cast out entirely, but in the more subtle, more dangerous way, where you're technically included, but only out of obligation. Where your achievements are acknowledged just enough to keep up appearances, yet never with the same pride or sparkle in the eye reserved for the real success story of the family. My brother Daniel, bless him and his easy charm, his friendly handshake and just shine shoes, had always held the spotlight. Even when I was the one doing the real heavy lifting, he made varsity football. While I quietly maintained a near-perfect GPA and applied for scholarships without anyone's help. I remember my father's voice at the dinner table, full of enthusiasm when Daniel passed his driver's test, the way he told the story 3 times to 3 different relatives, like it was the moon landing. When I got accepted into an out-of-state university on a full academic ride, he barely looked up from his paper and said, "That's great, honey," like I had told him we were out of orange juice. You'd think that kind of stuff loses its sting over time, but it doesn't. It just hides under layers of independence. Under all the self-affirmations and therapy sessions and relationships where you pretend you don't need anyone's approval because you've taught yourself how to live without it. But it's still there, pulsing under your ribs like a bruise you stopped touching but never quite forgot. And when I stood in that country club the night before, watching slideshow after slideshow of Daniel's milestones, hearing my father call him the best decision I ever made, I didn't need a reminder of where I stood. I'd already memorized the blueprint of my own erasure. I left the hotel early that next morning, long before anyone would be awake to notice, not out of cowardice, but because I didn't owe anyone a final goodbye. The car ride out of town was quiet, the kind of silence you don't fill with music or podcasts, the kind that gives space to thoughts you usually keep buried under to-do lists and phone calls. And during that drive, I remembered. Not just the big betrayals, those are easy to recall, but the tiny ones, the ones that accumulate until they become a second skin. I remembered the birthday party where they forgot to invite any of my friends, the way I had to blow out candles in front of Daniel's crowd because no one had planned mine separately. I remembered the time I broke my wrist at school and sat in the nurse's office for over 2 hours because no one answered the phone. My dad was at a sales meeting and Daniel had taken the car for something more important. I remembered my senior year science fair where I built a working prototype of a solar-powered water purifier and took home second place in the state. My father didn't even ask how it went. That same week, Daniel got a parking ticket dismissed, and my dad bought him lunch to celebrate his resourcefulness. Even after I moved out at 19, after the fight, the one where he called me ungrateful and I told him I wasn't his daughter, not really, just the girl who paid her own rent because love came with too many receipts, I still kept my distance. assuming time and absence might eventually make room for reconciliation. But it never came. When Mom passed, he didn't call me first, Daniel did. I found out from a voicemail. That voicemail still sits in my phone. I don't know why I've kept it. Maybe because it proves something I needed to know back then, that I wasn't overreacting, that the neglect I felt wasn't just in my head. And then there was the miscarriage. That one still catches in my throat. I was 28, living in Chicago, in love with someone who wasn't ready but swore he was. When I lost the baby, 7 weeks in, nothing dramatic, just an ambulance ride and a white curtain around my ER bed, I didn't tell anyone right away. But when I finally did, my father said, well, maybe it's for the best. Timing matters. Timing. As if I'd dropped a casserole on the floor instead of losing a life that I had already started to make space for. That was the moment I stopped expecting anything from him. That was the moment I became my own father, in a way firm, reliable, emotionally distant when necessary. I stopped sending birthday cards. I stopped answering late-night calls. I sent a text on Christmas. That was enough. So when I returned for the retirement party, I didn't expect applause or a speech. I didn't even expect a chair with my name on it. I came to see for myself if anything had changed. It hadn't. But I had. And that folder, God, that folder, wasn't just revenge. It was record-keeping. It was truth in a manila envelope. It was everything I remembered that they chose to forget, laid out plainly and without apology. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because sometimes the most deafening thing you can do is tell the truth and walk away while they're still deciding whether or not it matters. And trust me, they always read it eventually. They always open the drawer. The house was quieter than I had ever heard it, not the kind of quiet that comes from peace or rest, but the kind that wraps around your ankles like cold water, heavy and still, the kind that follows after the guests have left, after the music fades out, after all the performances are done and the masks are peeled off and folded away in drawers. There were a few half-empty wine glasses left on the counters, plates with fork-scraped frosting pushed to the edges, a couple of folding chairs leaned against the walls like forgotten extras after the final scene, and in the center of it all, that massive framed photograph of my father in uniform, lit from below like some kind of war hero, as if he hadn't spent the last 3 decades managing floor operations and pretending he didn't have a daughter with opinions too sharp for his liking. It was strange, walking through the house after all these years, not like a guest, not like a daughter either, more like a detective returning to the scene of a long cold crime, the evidence still tucked away under rugs and behind picture frames, waiting for someone to care enough to look. I didn't linger in the living room, and I didn't stop in the hallway where the photos were still hung in an order that had always told a very specific story, the one where Daniel was front and center in every chapter and I was, at best, a supporting character with no speaking lines. Instead, I moved upstairs, my footsteps soft on the carpet, more out of habit than secrecy, though I suppose some part of me didn't want to be heard, not because I was afraid, but because silence gives weight to what you're about to do. And I wanted the weight to be felt. His office was exactly as I remembered it, though maybe the furniture had been polished recently, or maybe it just looked shinier under the guilt I was carrying in my chest like a second heartbeat. The desk, that thick, walnut monolith he used to keep us away from when we were kids, sat in the same place near the window, the blinds half closed like always, filtering the moonlight into pale stripes that made everything look more theatrical than it had any right to be. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to second-guess myself now. I opened my bag, pulled out the folder, and held it for a moment before placing it down on the center of the desk, not tucked into a drawer or hidden beneath papers, but squarely in the open, positioned in a way that would be impossible to miss. The kind of placement that said, "This is meant to be found, and you know it." The folder wasn't thick, at least not in the way you'd expect a life's worth of wounds to be. Pain doesn't take up that much space when it's distilled into hard evidence. There were maybe a dozen pages inside, some printed, some handwritten, some copied from old documents I had spent years pretending I didn't still have. At the top was a letter. Not addressed, not signed. Just written in my hand, the only voice I had ever been able to trust, even when no one else was listening. In the letter, I told him things he didn't remember, or things he had never cared enough to learn. I told him about the time I had quietly called the utility company and paid his late gas bill after Daniel forgot to mail the check. I told him how I'd sat outside the hospital for 3 hours when he had chest pains 2 winters ago, waiting in my car, watching his room from the parking lot window, too proud to go inside because I knew he wouldn't want me there. I told him how I still remember the smell of his cologne on the coat he gave Daniel when I left for college without so much as a ride to the airport. I reminded him of my mother's voice on the phone the night before she died, how she said, "Take care of yourself, because he won't," and how she'd said it not with bitterness, but with certainty. As if it were just a simple truth she'd finally accepted after years of trying to prove it wrong. But the letter wasn't the worst part. The worst part, the part one knew would stick in his throat like a stone, was the evidence I'd found years ago but never dared to say out loud. It was a scanned copy of a joint account he had kept with a woman I didn't recognize, opened during the last 2 years of his marriage to my mother. It wasn't just about money, it was about betrayal. My mother had worked nights, saved every penny, packed his lunches, ironed his shirts. And in the end, he gave pieces of himself to someone else while she slowly unraveled in the background, never once telling anyone how much it hurt, never once asking us to choose sides. I found that document by accident when I was 24, digging through boxes in a storage unit he forgot to lock after moving. I kept it, not out of spite, but because something in me knew that one day, the narrative would need correcting. There were also photos. Not dramatic, not scandalous. Just quiet. One of me, asleep in my car outside my old apartment after he kicked me out for mouthing off during Thanksgiving. Another of me holding my newborn niece, Daniel's daughter, the one they said I was too busy to babysit, even though I'd flown across the country just to be there. I included the hospital wristband from the night of the miscarriage, the one he said nothing about. I included a copy of the check I wrote to help Daniel with his rent when his startup flopped, money I never saw again, and help my father gave him credit for. It wasn't about exposing secrets. It was about showing him the truth he had spent his life refusing to see, that I had been there, through all of it, not loudly, not in spotlighted speeches, but in the ways that actually mattered, in the places that cost something real. And then, at the bottom, I added one final page. Blank. Completely blank. I wanted him to sit with that emptiness, to stare at it and realize that no matter how many stories he'd told himself about who mattered and who didn't, there would always be pieces of me he never even tried to know. I closed the folder gently, pressing the edges flat with my palm, and then stood there for a moment longer, not because I had anything left to say, but because I needed to feel the gravity of what I had just done. Not every kind of revenge explodes. Some of it just waits. Waits to be opened. Waits to be read. I walked out of the room, my shoes barely making a sound on the floor, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I paused just once to glance back, not at the folder, not at the desk, but at the closed door behind which my father would eventually sit. Open that folder and feel for the first time in a long time that he had no control over the story anymore. And that was enough. For now. The sky was still that pale, uncommitted gray when I pulled onto the highway, the kind of dull, colorless morning that feels like it forgot how to be anything else, like the world itself hadn't quite woken up yet and was waiting for someone to give it a reason. I had barely slept, not because of nerves or guilt, those had long since calcified into something less volatile, but because my mind had entered that strange, alert stillness where every detail of the past 24 hours plays over and over again. Not in chaos, but in sequence, as if your memory is trying to study each frame like evidence in a case no one else bothered to open. The party, the speeches, the blank stares, the folder on the desk, it all felt more vivid in the car than it had in the moment, as if the act of leaving had sharpened the edges of everything I had chosen to walk away from. I wasn't rushing. I kept the speed steady, hands on the wheel, eyes flicking between the road and the line of trees blurring past the passenger side. I didn't play music. I didn't need a soundtrack. What I had done didn't need dramatizing, and I didn't want noise getting in the way of what came next. There was a weightlessness in my chest, not joy, not satisfaction, but a kind of emptiness that comes when you finally release something you've been carrying for too long. It wasn't over. I knew that. But something irreversible had shifted, and that thought stayed with me as I passed the first green sign that read, "Next city, 42 miles." When the phone rang, I knew before I looked who it was. The sound itself felt different, urgent in a way only family can make urgent. I let it ring once, then twice, then 3 times, just to give myself a few more seconds of silence. And then I answered, not with a hello, but with his name, calm and flat, Daniel. There was a beat of hesitation on the other end, like he wasn't sure if it was really me, or maybe he didn't know how to begin. But then his voice cracked through, low and frayed around the edges, as if he'd just run down a hallway or barely made it out of an argument. "What the hell did you do?" His words hung there, not really a question, not yet an accusation, just a raw, confused demand from someone who had finally realized the center of gravity in the family had shifted without his permission. I said nothing for a second, just breathed into the receiver, not because I was trying to be cold or mysterious, but because I honestly didn't know how to answer that in a way that would satisfy him. Because what I had done, really, was nothing more than tell the truth. No lies, no manipulation. Just facts. Facts, carefully arranged and left for someone who had spent decades living like the facts were optional. "He's in his room," Daniel said, after the silence stretched too long. "He won't come out. He hasn't spoken to anyone. He canceled his golf round, and Mom's been calling his name through the door for 20 minutes. I could hear the panic behind his words, not loud, but clear, a helplessness that comes from not understanding why the person you thought you knew is suddenly someone else, broken or fragile or human in a way you've never had to deal with. I pictured it easily, my father, behind that closed door, sitting with the folder open, pages spread across his lap or maybe clutched in one shaking hand, reading through pieces of a life he never acknowledged, now laid bare in black ink and old photographs. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel sorry for Daniel either. I felt steady. Daniel's voice changed, sharp now, like he'd found something to grab onto. "You wrote that letter, didn't you? That's your handwriting. And those photos. Jesus, Sarah, what are you trying to do to him? You know how much this family means to him. You think you're the only one who's been hurt around here." That line, so rehearsed, so predictable, almost made me laugh, but there was no humor in it. Just exhaustion. I had heard variations of it my whole life. "You're too sensitive. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You need to let it go." They had used every version of it over the years, wrapping my pain in guilt and trying to sell it back to me as selfishness. But not anymore. I finally spoke, not loudly, but with enough weight that I knew it would land. "I didn't do anything to him. I just let him see it." Daniel scoffed, the kind of sound someone makes when they're not sure if they should keep yelling or hang up. "So that's it? You just drop a bomb and disappear? You think that's brave?" I leaned my head back against the seat, feeling the tension in my neck loosen. "You think it was easy to keep my mouth shut for 20 years while you got to be the golden boy and I got to sit in the audience of my own life? You think that folder is a bomb? It's a receipt, Daniel. That's all. I'm not burning anything down, I'm just showing you the damage that's already there." For a moment, he didn't respond. And then his voice, suddenly smaller, more uncertain. "You really think he deserved this?" I closed my eyes, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to choose my words carefully. Deserve has nothing to do with it. He earned it. I heard a shaky breath on the other end, then a faint clatter, like he'd dropped the phone on a table, maybe stepped away. I didn't wait for him to return. I ended the call. The road stretched ahead, endless and unchanging. I didn't feel victorious. This wasn't a victory. This was a reckoning. As I drove, I reached over and opened the glove box, my fingers brushing against the second folder, the copy. Still sealed. Still untouched. Not for him. Not for Daniel. For me. For backup. For proof that I hadn't imagined it all, hadn't made it up out of thin air like they used to suggest when I asked too many questions or remembered too much. Some truths need to be seen to be believed. Others only need to be remembered. And I remembered everything. It had been just under 2 weeks since the folder left my hands and entered his world, yet every day that passed felt like a year stretched thin and brittle, filled not with questions, because I had none left, but with the slow, almost clinical process of watching what once held power over me begin to disintegrate under the weight of its own carefully maintained lies. I didn't hear from anyone during that time, not Daniel, not my father, not the stepmother whose name I had stopped using in sentences that required warmth, and, honestly, I hadn't expected to. I knew them well enough to understand that when they were faced with something they couldn't explain away or bury under smiles and toast speeches, they didn't confront it, they went quiet, hoping it would go away on its own or morph into something less threatening with time. But silence, as I had learned better than anyone in that family, was never neutral. Silence always had a shape. It filled rooms. It echoed. It waited. And this time I knew it wasn't mine to carry. I had placed the burden exactly where it belonged, and if it grew too heavy, too loud, too impossible to ignore, then maybe, finally, they would feel what I had felt every year they wrote me out of the story they liked to tell themselves. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the email came. It wasn't from Daniel or from anyone directly related to the fallout. It was a mass email, one of those accidental group forwards that usually happen when people hit reply all without realizing it. It had been started by someone from my father's old veterans group, responding to a cancellation. Apparently, he had withdrawn from an upcoming speaking engagement, one he'd committed to nearly a year prior, and in the short thread that followed, there was mention of him stepping down from the local community board he chaired, of him taking time for personal matters, which was, in our family, code for something cracked, and we're not ready to say what. The next day, Daniel sent a single text message, short, almost antiseptic in tone, no emotion, no punctuation, just 5 words that hovered on my screen like a phantom limb refusing to disappear. He's not the same anymore. No, hi. No, how are you? No attempt at small talk or repair. Just that sentence. No follow-up. I didn't respond. What was there to say? That I was sorry? That I hadn't expected this? That he should have seen it coming? He wouldn't have believed any of it, and I wasn't going to insult us both by pretending I regretted doing what I did. There are moments in life when you know, with absolute clarity, that you have done the exact thing the situation called for, even if it costs you whatever thin, brittle thread of peace you'd been pretending to keep alive for appearance's sake. It's strange what doesn't change after something big like that. My life continued. My deadlines remained. Clients still wanted drafts and logos and revisions. The world, in its blind indifference, moved forward. But something internal had shifted, as if a door I'd been pressing against for years had finally given way and collapsed inward, not with a bang, but with a long, slow creak that echoed inside me for days. I wasn't lighter, exactly, but I was different. And that difference changed the way I looked at everything. There was a lake just outside the city, a place I hadn't visited in years, but that week, I drove there without really thinking about it, as if some part of me needed water, needed sky, needed space to feel the aftermath without distraction. It wasn't particularly beautiful, just a stretch of grayish water bordered by reeds and old picnic benches, but it was quiet, and quiet, for once, didn't feel like a threat. I parked, walked to the edge of the water, sat down on a rock that looked like it had been waiting for me, and stared across the surface until the lines between water and sky began to blur. I had brought the second folder with me, not because I intended to read it, but because I hadn't quite known what else to do with it. It had sat in my glove box since the day I left the party, a quiet witness to everything, a backup in case I ever needed to remind myself that none of it had been in my head. But now, with the wind brushing against my face and the distant hum of cars blending with birdsong, I felt no urgency to protect it anymore. Whatever power it held had already done its work. Whatever truth it had carried was no longer mine to wield. I took it out, stared at it in my lap, and thought about what it meant to let go of something not because it no longer mattered, but because it had finally served its purpose. Then, without ceremony, without a speech or even a whispered farewell, I struck a match and held it to the corner. It caught slowly, the way truth often does, not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, steady burn that doesn't flinch or blink. I watched the edges curl, the ink melt, the photos blacken and twist into shapes no longer recognizable. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph either. Just a stillness. Just the clean, unmistakable sensation of finality. The ashes blew sideways into the water, drifting like tired leaves, and I thought about my father, alone in his office or his room, reading those words over and over again, maybe angry, maybe stunned, maybe something else entirely. Maybe, for the first time, wondering how a man could raise a daughter and never actually know her. Maybe regretting. Or maybe not. I would never know. And I didn't need to. As I stood up, brushing dirt from the back of my coat, I realized I hadn't said his name once during the entire ritual. Not in my thoughts. Not out loud. Not even as a punctuation. It didn't seem necessary anymore. He had spent his life building a version of me that was easy to ignore, and now he would live with the version of me that refused to stay hidden. That was the real reckoning. That was the actual inheritance I left behind, not money, not damage, but memory. Undeniable, unfiltered, unreturnable. And so I walked back to my car, the smell of smoke still lingering faintly in the air, and I drove home without checking my phone, without looking in the mirror, without wondering what might come next. Because whatever came, I had already said everything I needed to say. Not out loud. Not to his face. But in the only language he had ever taught me to use, silence laced with truth. A silence so sharp it couldn't be ignored. A silence that, unlike me, he would never be able to forget.